Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call in progress now be vitiated.
Without objection, so ordered.
And Mr. President, I ask that I be recognized as if in morning business for such time as I shall consume.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I was really somewhat in shock last October when the vote came up, and we actually 75 senators in the United States Senate and about 75% of the United States House of Representatives voted to give an unelected bureaucrat $700 billion to do with as he wanted, with no accountability. And I really believe, Mr. President, that 20 or 30 years from now, historians will look back and say that that was the most outrageous vote maybe in the history of these institutions. And the administration has now requested the second $350 billion to sometime this week. Now, if you're a reasonable person and we're to assume that a major event in the financial world has prompted the negotiations that led to the decision to release the second $350 billion, you would be wrong. The true reason is Congress may be asked to release the second $350 billion. It's just politics, and it's a hot potato. Nobody wants it, but they all want the money, and that's what we're faced with now. Again, no event in the financial world has prompted the request for the second $350 billion. I was critical of the Bush administration, and particularly of Secretary Paulson, since the October 10th vote giving Paulson, an unelected bureaucrat, $700 billion to do with as he wished. You know, it's hard for me and it's hard for Americans to understand when they talk about these huge $1 billion and $1 trillion, what it really means. But I took the time to count the actual number of families who file tax returns in America. And if you do your math with your $700 billion, it comes to $5,000 a family. Now, that's what we're talking about. This isn't just a little deal. It was huge. And I think people look at some of the things that happened since then. It was really the fault of passing the $700 billion that precipitated all the problems that we have. Now, we're asked, I guess Congress is asked as an institution to prepare to say yes to the next $350 billion in deficit spending simply because we receive letters of assurances. Now, I don't know what letters of assurances are or a letter of assurances, but I suppose it's the same kind of assurance that we got from Secretary Paulson when he looked at us and he said, we've got to have $700 billion and it's got to be used to buy up damaged assets. Now, the letter of assurance is a bunch of promises on paper, and that's not sufficient justification for this institution to let go of the $350 billion in taxpayers' money. Congress needs to put itself back in the process when we're talking about this kind of money. That's why I introduced legislation S-64 with a bipartisan group of senators that which says that the executive branch can only have access to the remaining $350 billion if Congress approves the submitted plan and votes on that plan. Now, what's so bad about that? This is the way we've been doing business for years and years. The administration will make requests. That's what they do in the budget process. It comes to Congress. We evaluate that and determine whether or not we who are the elected representatives, believe that it's something that should take place. Now, we've already seen that the legislation we passed last fall is a blank check for one person to do whatever he wants to with billions of dollars. Take, for instance, the auto bailout. The interesting thing about the auto bailout is everyone expressed all this outrage over the auto bailout. Well, I said back in October when 75% of the members of the House and the Senate voted to give Secretary Paulson $700 billion to do with as he wished, that who's going to be next in line to be bailed out? I'd suggested aviation, then the auto industry, and farmers, and everybody else. And that's exactly what did happen. And so those people who expressed such an outrage with the auto bailout, stop and realize, if it hadn't been for that vote to turn loose and turn over $700 billion, then that couldn't have happened. And people talk about the, whatever it was, 15 billion or whatever it was, in the auto bailout, that only constituted 2% of the $700 billion. So that's what we have to keep our minds on as to what really precipitated the problem that we have now. Now, we were told what was going to be done with the money. Paulson came to us in September and said if we didn't immediately come through with $700 billion, that's what he said it would take, to buy bad assets, the total economy would collapse. It was a panic scenario. Then the plans changed, and Paulson began, and this happened right after he got his hands on the $700 billion. He didn't use it to buy damaged assets. He used it to pass out to various financial institutions, banks. Now, it's my belief that the rationale for releasing any more of the $700 billion no longer applies. As a matter of fact, a prominent economist from the Reagan administration just last Wednesday said that the first $350 billion did absolutely no good in terms of dealing with the recession that we're currently in. It was clear to me at the time that it was a mistake to sign a blank check to one man for such a tremendous amount of money. Though there are still significant challenges in financial markets, it appears that the threat of financial crisis spinning out of control that we faced in the Great Depression, which was the original justification for the grant of such sweeping authority, has subsided. As the need to allow one person, whether it's Secretary Paulson or Timothy Gaither, to give away hundreds of billions of taxpayers' dollars to banks subsided as well? That's a question that needs to be asked, and that answer is yes. I fully understand the severity of the ongoing financial crisis that erupted this past year. I'm fully aware of the need to take extraordinary action in such situations. From the rescue of Bear Stearns in March to the announcement of the bank equity purchase program in mid-October of 2 bailouts for AIG to hundreds of billions extended to Citigroup and U.S. government has indeed undertaken an extraordinary effort to calm financial markets. However, it's clear to me and many of my colleagues that the Treasury accessing the remaining $350 billion will do little to fix the recession we're now in. It's time for the United States government to cease announcements of new programs or plans designed to inject confidence in markets. Moreover, I think confidence would be better instilled by halting the announcement of new billion-dollar programs designed to fix markets. I understand the need to move in accordance with changing conditions. Simply think the time has come to stop having the government try to fix markets. The markets are going to have to fix themselves. Now, that's going to take some time. It's not going to be a pleasant process, but we're fooling ourselves if we think we can come up with some easy shortcut to solving these problems. One of the major causes of this crisis was the accumulation of far too much debt on the part of some financial institutions. The U.S. government can make the same mistake. We're now anticipating an astounding $1.2 trillion deficit this year alone, and that's before any accounting of the roughly $300 billion stimulus proposal. I can remember so many people in this body criticizing President Bush on his deficits. If you take the total deficits in the Bush administration and add them up and divide by 8 the years that he's been in there, the average is $247 billion. $247 billion. Now we're looking at $1.2 trillion. Now, this massive debt accumulation poses a serious threat to future stability and economic growth. We're on track to have a budget deficit this year that exceeds the size of the entire federal budget only a few years ago. However, we can immediately make progress on reducing that deficit amount by not releasing the $350 billion. That's something that deserves sufficient debate. Finally, as a fiscal conservative, the thing that really concerns me about the $700 billion bailout is that it permanently changed the perception about what is big in big government from now on. What's another $50 billion here or $100 billion there after we give $700 billion to banks? What's the big deal about a $1 trillion deficit or an $800 billion stimulus package, or multi-billion health care proposals, or whatever plan is dreamed up around here to spend the taxpayers' money. Once we gave $700 billion to an unelected bureaucrat with no oversight, we have completely lost our perspective. And people now are looking as if it's the amounts have changed in their own minds. I will close by noting the cost of the following defining events in the 20th century of our shared history and compare them with the $700 billion bailout to hopefully bring a little perspective to the debate over the request for the second half of the $700 billion bailout. The Marshall Plan, that was a long time ago, but if you bring it up to date, that would amount to $115 billion. This is after inflation. The race to the moon was $237 billion. The entire Korean War, $454 billion. The New Deal, $500 billion. The Vietnam War, $698 billion. And then 8 years in Iraq, in the liberation of Iraq, people complaining about how much money it costs. It's less than the $700 billion that we're talking about here. We can't put on fast track the remaining $350 billion in this package. Congress is going to have to actively debate sending any further funding. Now, what my legislation does, first of all, if we don't do anything at all, if we just sit back and act like everything's fine and wait until the proposal comes to us, then only thing we can do under the law that we passed in October of this past year was have a resolution of disapproval. Well, if the leadership, if Senator Reid and the leadership decides we shouldn't have a vote on that, I'm sure they'll have procedural ways to keep us from having a vote. But even if there is a vote, they would have that control. So that doesn't do any good at all. The only way to do it is to pass this bill that says we can't spend the last $350 billion until they come forth with the program, we evaluate it, we take our prerogative as that is given to us in the Constitution by and determine whether or not this is a wise expenditure of these funds. So I hope that I'll have several others wanting to join S64, and really, who could argue with accountability? I'll yield the floor.